broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, but wanted to give you the heads up that we will be starting shortly. So grab a coffee or a drink, take a bathroom break, whatever you need, and we'll get started in about 3 minutes. All right, talk to you soon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. So you're thinking about studying law in the UK. We are happy to welcome you this evening. My name is Heidi Schultz, and I am the manager of Canada Law from Abroad. I believe you all will have signed up for our advising service and be working with one of our advisors, which is awesome news. I'm hoping that this webinar will give you some more information about your options to study law in the UK, and especially at the University of Sussex. And just a couple housekeeping things before we get started on the presentation. You won't be able to use your mic or speak directly to us as part of the software. So if you do have any questions, I want you to find the questions box. You'll see it in your dashboard on the right-hand side near the bottom. And if you can just pop that out and send me a quick question saying that you found the box, you know where it is. Just send me a quick hi, hello, whatever you like, just to make sure that you have access to that and it's all working would be great. I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. Thank you, Etta, I got yours. Anna, I saw your hand was up. Can you shoot a question in the question box there so we make sure you have access to that? All right, anybody else? Thanks, Alex. Got your just checking in message. That's awesome. Anna, great, you found the box. Wonderful. Okay, we've got a few more that need to give a chance. Thanks, Omar. couple more still looking for the box. Well, let us know. Okay, Julia, you're looking for the box. Okay, so it's on the right-hand side, and the title of it is Questions. So if you find that, and just click the little triangular arrow on the left of the questions word there, you'll find a box, and then you can put your question in there. All right, anybody else? I think we're still missing a couple. Well, if you can't find the questions box, then pop your hand up and we will give you further directions as to where to find that. And we will be taking questions throughout the presentation, but answering them at the end. So please do feel free to ask your questions as you think of them. Just pop them into the questions box and we'll review at the end of the presentation. Beyond that, we will be sending around a recording of the presentation as well as a set of the presentation slides in the next few days. So if you don't receive those by the middle of next week, then check in with your advisor and they can send you a copy. Other than that, I think we're ready to get started. So I would like to introduce you to our presenter today, Sabrina Gilani, and she is a professor at the University of Sussex in their law school. So I'm going to let her take it away and she can tell you a bit more about what she does and take the presentation forward. So send your questions and we will talk to you at the end. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Perfect, Heidi. Before we start, I just want to say that I'm new to this software. This is the first time I've actually done a webinar on this software. So, work with me. I apologize if things aren't working properly. And I've got my webcam on for right now, just as I introduced the talk, but I will turn it off in just a moment so that you can concentrate on the slides that I've got up. So welcome to my session on studying law in the UK. In recent years, we've had a huge influx of Canadian students thinking about doing their law degree abroad. And I'm hoping that some of the information that I pass on to you today is helpful in terms of making that decision and thinking about your transition to the United Kingdom. So just to tell you a bit more about me, I'm sure you can tell from my accent that I'm Canadian. I'm originally from Calgary, Alberta. I went to university at the University of Calgary and then changed to Carleton University and then did my master's in Nottingham in the UK and then did my PhD here in the UK at King's College London. And currently I teach both English and Canadian law at the University of Sussex, which is in southeast England, just along the coast, and I live in the city of Brighton and Hove. So I've sort of lived, studied, and worked in several areas of Canada as well as the UK, so I can give you some tips and information about what it's like to live in the Midlands, which is, like it sounds, smack in the middle of the UK, but also some information about what it might be to live in like a big city like London, but also Brighton, which is a bit smaller. The information I want to pass on to you today, most of it is quite broad, and it's not meant to be institution specific. So it should apply more or less to most schools across the UK that are offering a law degree to Canadian students. But I'm often drawing on my own experiences from my own institution. So when I talk about things like course structure or marking guidance, things like that, I'm drawing on kind of my experience at the University of Sussex. I want to keep today's webinar extremely informal. I want to touch on just some of the basics about things that you should think about as you are thinking about doing your degree abroad. And like Heidi said, we'll take questions throughout, but I'll save answering them towards the end. Okay, so let's start. So I'm going to turn off my webcam now, and then hopefully this presentation works. Okay, perfect. Okay, so just to give you a brief outline of the talk, these are some of the topics that I will cover as the talk progresses. Admission guidelines, which actually Heidi and her team are probably a lot more knowledgeable about, particularly since they're dealing with schools across the country. So I won't spend too much time on this. And of course, Heidi, if there's something that I've misinterpreted or something I'm missing, please feel free to jump in and correct me. I'll talk a little bit about money, which is something I'm sure most students and parents are extremely conscious of. I'll give you some information about tuition costs and other costs that you should be budgeting for when studying abroad. I know one of the big concerns that a lot of students have when deciding about whether to study law in the UK is the difference between a JD and an LLB. Is it better to have a JD? So I'll give you some information about what distinguishes one from the other. And then I'll move on to talking a bit about the UK grading system because it's extremely different than Canada. I'll give you information about what a typical LLB course structure looks like, what the NCA process might look like, and then I think this is actually the most important part of my presentation. I'm going to give you a list of questions that I think you should be asking any institution that you're thinking about attending, and questions that you should look at how institutions are answering before you choose the university that you want to attend to do your law degree. Often I've had parents or students come to me and ask me about why they ought to send their children to Sussex or Kent or City University instead of places like Oxford and Cambridge. And my answer to that is that these elite universities these less elite universities are more likely to actually create a more suitable environment for Canadian students because places like Oxford and Cambridge may be more reliant on their name for exposure rather than student experience. But over the years, I've kind of put together a list of questions that I think you should be asking any university you're thinking of attending, including Oxford and Cambridge, to ensure that you have the best possible student experience as well as post-graduation support. And then the last things I'll discuss at the end of the talk is information about living in the UK and working in the UK. And then finally, I'll end with some information about my own institution for those of you that are possibly interested in attending the University of Sussex. And then, of course, like Heidi mentioned, hopefully we have some time to go through the questions that you might have at the end. Okay, so let's get started. So most UK law schools catering to Canadian students will have two types of programs on offer. They will have a fast-track graduate entry or senior status LLB, which is for students who have a previous undergraduate degree and would like to complete their LLB quicker, so in 2 years instead of 3 years. Basically, these students would simply complete the main kind of core modules or courses and none of the optional modules to get their qualifying law degree. And then this would require, of course, more accreditation exams or NCA exams once they return back to Canada. But essentially, if you have a previous undergraduate degree, you can do a UK LLB in 2 years. And then schools will also have the regular qualifying law degree program, which is a 3-year LLB. And the grade requirements vary considerably between schools, and sometimes schools will accept lower grades than posted in their syllabi or in their school handbooks. So it's always worth sending an application to an institution, even if your grades fall slightly below their listed requirements. Now, there's two things I want to point out here. One, you can actually do a law degree in the UK right after high school. So you can be a Canadian high school student or someone that's just finished high school and go on to do the LLB in the UK. And secondly, the grade requirements are much higher for the graduate entry program than the 3-year LLB. But in the case of Sussex, I also know that students who have applied to the graduate entry LLB with grades that are considerably lower than the 70 to 75% that they're required to have in their undergraduate degree have still been accepted by Sussex, but just offered the 3-year LLB instead of the 2-year. So there are ways of getting around these grade requirements to some degree, as long as you're kind of falling just minimally below the requirements. Now, as part of the UCAS application, you're also required to submit a personal statement. and a reference letter. And kind of speaking from my experience at Sussex, I know that these two things become considerably more important if you're sitting on the cusp of the admission requirements. So if you have a 70% and you're applying for the graduate entry, we might still make you an offer if you have excellent references or a personal statement that, for instance, explains why you may have fallen short of the grade entrance requirements. So if there was a sickness or a family death or something, the personal statement might be a good place for you to kind of explain that. So in short, all parts of the UCAS application are important and not just your grade transcripts. I think the single largest expense for studying abroad is tuition, which in Canadian dollars will range between $21,500 and $31,500, depending on the school that you're applying to. Now, while that might seem extremely high, it is comparable to Canadian law schools. So University of Toronto, for instance, charges $34,000 for the year, Osgoode $26,000, and Western $22,000. So you're paying a similar price for a legal education in Canada as well. Law school is expensive anywhere you go, I guess. Now, on top of tuition, you'll also need to think about living expenses. And accommodation becomes extremely expensive if you're living in bigger cities like London or Manchester in comparison to kind of smaller towns, say, for example, in the Midlands, Nottingham and Leicester, were a lot cheaper to live in. But in general, you should budget for around $800 to $2,500 a month for about 9 months. And of course, that depends on the location where you're living, but also if you're living alone or with roommates. Food, public transit, books are other costs that you should be thinking about, and then a whole range of sort of miscellaneous costs as well. Now, the good thing is a lot of those miscellaneous costs are actually a lot cheaper in the UK than in Canada. So, for example, travel is ridiculously cheap in the UK. You can travel from the UK to Spain or Portugal, for example, for less than $100 return. Another thing that's actually quite competitively priced in the UK are cell phone plans. Cell phone plans range for between $18 to $25 for plans that you would pay over $100 here in Canada for. But in general, I would suggest that your budget, you should budget your costs to be about between 35 and 45,000 Canadian dollars per year. And of course, again, the exchange rate needs to be factored in here. And the exchange rate is extremely good for Canadians right now, darn Brexit. And it figures now that I'm earning in UK dollars, the Canadian rate is much better. So, you know, like I said, that needs to be factored in as well, because even a few cents of difference in terms of exchange rate could make a large difference in the amount of money that you're budgeting for when we're talking about costs around $40,000 a year. Okay, so this is a question that I get asked a lot by both students and parents, and I think it's actually a very valid one. What is the difference between an LLB and a JD, and does it matter? So it's only been about 15 years since Canadian universities have begun to replace their LLB degrees with the JD. So when I went to law school, we had, so that was in about 2004, we still had LLB degrees. And you'll find that most prestigious law firms with a lot of older associates will still have LLBs. Now, the main difference, or the only difference between the JD and an LLB, is that the JD was adopted by American schools to signify the fact that a law degree in the US was a postgraduate degree, that students that went into law already had an undergraduate degree before doing so. So they weren't getting a bachelor's degree, which is what the LLB is. They were getting a more advanced postgraduate degree. Now, obviously, Canada is the same way, right? You need to have an undergraduate degree in order to go to law school. And so Canadian schools, starting in 2001 with the University of Toronto, began to call their law degree JDs as well. And one of the main reasons that Canadian law schools did so, and especially the University of Toronto, was due to its geographic proximity to the US, which meant that many Canadian students graduating from the U of T were actually going across the border to find jobs. And having an LLB instead of a JD was causing them a lot of problems in terms of obtaining jobs in the US market and getting paid a comparable amount to American JD graduates. So to sort of alleviate this job market disadvantage, U of T adopted the JD. Now, other Canadian schools that didn't have as many graduates going to the US, so for example, the University of Calgary actually didn't replace their LLB with the JD until around 2010. So it was really about putting Canadian graduates on equal footing with US graduates in the US market. Now, in the UK, students can go to law school right after high school. And for that reason, the LLB remains a bachelor's degree in the UK. So I guess the question becomes, now that Canada has the JD, will having an LLB disadvantage students coming back home? And the answer to that is, actually, I don't know. I don't know if it's going to cause disadvantage. What I do know is that having kept in really good contact with many of my Canadian students through alumni events, through reference writing, through LinkedIn, and catching up with them whenever I'm in town, I can tell you that many of my graduates have had no problem finding employment. Up until a few years ago, I actually used to tell my Canadian students that were coming from Sussex back to Canada that they had to be extremely flexible about finding a job in Canada, that they shouldn't set their sights on Bay Street firms, that they shouldn't set their sights on coming back to Toronto and working in Toronto firms, because the competition was so stiff and because these places were recruiting from places like Osgood. It was just much harder for them to find a job in these places because of their international law, LLB. But actually, I think that's changed. I've had several students now, I would say 10 to 15 students at least that I know of that have found jobs in Toronto firms, a couple of them on Bay Street. So I actually don't think the LLB is as much of a hindrance to finding employment as it once was. And I think it's quite common to find a good competitive job in Canada while still having an LLB. What I do think matters, from what I hear from my students, is grades. Your grades do matter. Because many of my students have said that they were selected for an interview based on their law school grades. And they've also said that the person matters, right? What sort of achievements have they had outside of law school? What kind of personality do they have? Are they confident? Are they knowledgeable? Are they thoughtful? Are they well-spoken? And actually, references matter. What do their formal employers and teachers say about them? So these are some of the tips that some of my previous students have said I should pass on to new graduates headed for the job market and new applicants actually thinking about doing their law degree abroad. So that being said, the fact that grades are important, I think this is a good segue to talking about the very different grading system in the UK. Now in the UK, a student has achieved an honors degree if their grade or their overall degree is above 70%. This is, in the English system, this is referred to as a first class honors or a first. Below that, from a 60 to 69% is a 2-1 or upper second class degree, and a 50 to 59% is a 2-2 or a lower second class. Now, the majority of good students will receive a 2-1, but the majority of students overall will fall in the 2-2 range, so the 50 to 59%. Now, generally at Sussex, our Canadian students score much higher, having a mean between 5 and 10% higher than our regular LLB students. And I know that at Sussex, many of the faculty members actually fight to teach graduate entry Canadian students because they find that these students are just so much more well prepared, they're extremely competitive, and so the seminar discussion just tends to be more sophisticated, of course, which is something we enjoy. So the honors mark of 70% is different than in Canada, where where honors degrees are usually 80 to 85% and higher. But that being said, fails are also extremely different in the UK. So a fail, or a fourth class degree, is anything below 39%, and it's actually pretty difficult to fail a course, but not unheard of. If you do fail a course, then this is also different than in Canada. You don't actually have to redo the course over again, but just redo the assessment at a capped mark of 40%. But what I try to tell my Canadian students is that this is actually a really risky place to be in, because you risk not having your degree recognized by the NCA. So it's always important to stay within that 50 to 59 range, if possible. Most law schools in the UK, similar to law schools in Canada, will generally use one mode of assessment for their courses: a final exam that's usually worth 100% of your grade. At Sussex, for full year modules, we'll usually use two modes of assessment: an essay that's 25%, and an exam that's worth 75%. The other thing you should know, which is very different in the UK, is that your grades are virtually unappealable. And the reason for that is that your papers and your exams are marked by so many people before a grade is assigned. So for example, if a course exam is being marked by 2 or 3 different members of faculty, generally the 2 or 3 of us will meet together and will first mark papers, 5 papers together, to calibrate our grading so that all of us are on the same page. And we make decisions about what constitutes a fail, what constitutes a 2-2, and what kind of paper would result in a first. And then we all go away and we first mark our papers. And then after we first mark, 10 to 20% of the papers, plus all the papers that are failed, are second marked by another member of staff. And if there's a huge discrepancy between the first grader and the second grader, then they meet together to discuss what sort of grade should be assigned to a paper based on the merits of that paper. And then after that, a moderator actually looks through all the course exam papers and marks to ensure consistency. Are we giving the same kinds of papers the same sorts of marks? After that, all the papers go to an external examiner at a completely different university, who again looks at them for consistency, to make sure that we haven't been unduly lenient or unduly difficult. And then finally, when those papers return back from the external examiner, that's when the grade is assigned. So obviously the pros of that process is that most papers will be looked at least twice. Failed papers will be looked at 2 or 3 times. And of course, the con of that process is that, as I stated earlier, appeals become extremely difficult based on, if those appeals are filed based on academic judgment. Okay, you can still appeal a grade based on extenuating circumstances, but not because you think you've been marked unfairly based on the marker's judgment. Okay, so another thing that's very different about the academic system in the UK is the structure of the academic year. Term 1 usually begins at the end of September, whereas in Canada it tends to begin at the beginning of September. There's usually a 2 to 3 week Christmas break, and then exams for Term 1 courses, they happen after Christmas break, which is different from the Canadian system, where you have exams before you break. That means that Term 2 lectures actually do not begin till the end of January. And then this is the most annoying thing: we actually break for Christmas, or sorry, break for Easter, which in Canada is 3 to 5 days, but in the UK, Easter break is 2 to 3 weeks. And that's smack in the middle of Term 2, and then you come back for 2 to 3 more weeks of classes. And then you have your exams, which run from May to June, so you actually don't break for the summer until mid-June, and then summer break lasts from mid-June to the end of September. So your summer breaks are shorter. They don't start halfway through till they don't start till halfway through June, whereas in Canada usually it's at the end of April. Each teaching term is 11 weeks long, which again is different from Canada, where I think teaching terms are 13 weeks long, although someone tells me that this might be also changing. So there's quite a few differences between the UK and Canada in terms of the academic calendar. Okay, so what will your typical law degree look like in terms of course structure? And again, this varies from institution to institution. So I'm speaking primarily from my experience at Sussex. Now, the first 2 years, all students doing both a graduate entry or a 3-year LLB, the first 2 years are spent doing core modules. Okay, so these are modules that everyone is required to take. At Sussex, you have the option in year 1 to do English public law and substitute Canadian constitutional law for public law 2. Okay, so everyone has to do public law 1 and 2, but students can substitute Canadian constitutional law for public law 2. And then students in the first year will also do English legal system, justice, equality, and society, and then a full year of contract law and tort law as well. In year 2, all students will do a full year of EU law, English criminal law, equity and trust, and land law. And so graduate entry students, since they're only doing a 2-year degree, will only do all the core modules, the first 2 years of core modules. And then those of you that are doing the 3-year degree in the 3rd year, you'll have a whole range of optional modules to take. And here I've listed just some of the optional modules that we have available here at Sussex. Now, as I said earlier, full year modules are assessed using an essay and an exam, and half-year modules will usually only have one mode of assessment. Optional modules in year 3 will have a range of modes of assessment, usually not an exam. But for example, I teach legal theory for 3rd year students, and we assess students through a reflective portfolio along with an essay and a viva, which is an oral exam. So faculty are allowed to be much more creative assessing optional modules, mostly because the student numbers are so much lower than in core modules. Okay, so the NCA process. Now, here I just want to cite 2 caveats before I talk about this. First, Heidi and her team will probably be much more knowledgeable and will have a much clearer idea of the NCA process than I will. And secondly, so they could probably help you way more than me. And secondly, it's really up to you as students to consult the NCA website, which I've linked here, to determine the requirements for your degree. The requirements change often, and although we try to keep on top of these changes when advising students, the onus is really on students to make sure that they're continuing to meet their NCA requirements as they progress through their degree. Generally, the NCA is the accreditation body that recognizes your international degree as appropriate for practice in Canada, and they do so by assessing your degree and then having you complete a set of accreditation exams to show that you have the requisite Canadian legal knowledge in order to practice in Canada. So while a lot of the doctrines and principles that English law uses are the same, the NCA, what they're actually doing is they're checking that not only that you can appropriately recall and apply those principles, but also that you're aware of how those principles and doctrines have been applied in Canada in relation to Canadian cases. Now, most UK LLB degree holders, if they've done a 3-year LLB, they'll have to write these 5 core exams that I've listed. And those of you that do a 2-year LLB will have to write 7 exams, so 2 in addition to these 5. And again, the number of exams you will have to write will depend on how the NCA assesses your transcript. So for instance, if a student receives a pretty low grade in land law or tort law, the NCA might also ask them to write exams in these courses as well. So the minimum exams that you will have to write is 5, but this number could be a lot higher depending on your grades and the type of degree you have. Like I mentioned, it's best if you continue to consult the NCA website during your degree to ensure that you're meeting all of their requirements. Okay. So as I said at the beginning of my talk, there are a list of questions that I've put together over the years that I think you need to ask any institution you're thinking of attending to get the best idea of whether it provides the sort of support and environment that you as a Canadian student would most benefit from. And the first thing you want to know is whether they already have Canadian students and what is the breakdown of Canadian to home or domestic students or international students overall. And there are several reasons why I think you might want to know this. First, some Canadian students go to study in the UK because they want a quote-unquote authentically British experience in terms of their UK education. Okay, so they don't want to go to a school where they're going to be meeting all the same sorts of people that they'd be meeting back home. Okay, they really want to immerse themselves in British culture, and they don't want to go to a school where half the students in their class will be international or Canadian students, because this invariably changes the dynamics in the classroom. Other students may want to go to a school where there are many Canadian students because they think that will help them feel more comfortable and less homesick. More Canadian students also means that there's potential for more Canadian student-led initiatives, study groups organized by Canadian students for other Canadian students, social events, etc. Of course, more Canadian students also says something about the reputation of the institution back home. Chances are the more Canadian students at an institution, the more of a presence that institution has in Canada. And it may also say something about the kind of recognition that institution may have amongst Canadian law firms. More Canadian students will also mean, as my second question asks, that they are more likely, that institution is more likely to teach Canadian law modules. And this becomes important because, as many of my older students have indicated, students can use these modules as prep courses for their NCA, and they don't have to suffer through self-study. So at Sussex, we offer, for example, Canadian constitutional law, Canadian administrative law, and then starting next year, we'll also be offering Aboriginal law with a focus on Canadian Aboriginal issues. And so at least for admin and constitutional law, this means that students who graduate can pretty much write those NCA exams right away without needing time for self-study, because they've already taken those courses and have already compiled those notes. Third, and this is important, not only, the third thing that I think you should ask your institution, and this is important, I think, is whether the law school has a Canadian Students Law Society. Now, this isn't only important in terms of social activities, but also because law societies have a lot of political power within a school. When there are things that teachers might be doing to disadvantage Canadian students, or that may be having the effect of disadvantaging Canadian students, at Sussex, the Law Society will take this up. We'll take this issue up with the head of school, and we'll try to champion change. So, for example, at Sussex, the law school, or the Canadian Students Law Society, has exerted a lot of pressure on the school to subsidize Canadian-specific social events, focus more attention on how we assess, grade, and feedback to students, how we structure the time of our assessments. So some of our students were saying that they don't want to have assessments really far apart, like they don't want one happening right after Christmas break and then another one not happening for 2 weeks, because that means that they have to come back from Canada a lot earlier. So the Canadian Students Law Society came and had a chat with our head of school, who then tried to structure our assessment policy around this need that Canadian students had indicated. And because Canadian students are 15 to 20% of our student body, we believe it's important to continue to keep them happy. And so the Law Society is an extremely important medium through which Canadian students can channel their concerns, queries, and issues back to the school. You also want to see if the school you are thinking of attending has faculty members who are Canadian. And this is important, again, for several reasons. If the school is actively recruiting Canadian students, then having Canadian faculty who can teach Canadian courses and offer a different sort of pastoral support to these Canadian students shows a level of commitment and investment by the university to the students that they are recruiting. Now, as a Canadian, I'm more knowledgeable about, for instance, the NCA process in Canada, how students become licensed in Canada, what the bar exams are like, how to structure reference letters. So, for instance, in my reference letters for Canadian students, I will make mention of how the grading system differs in the UK and where I feel the students' grades, how they compare to letter grades in the UK. I can also give students advice on how the banking process is different in the UK, what sort of cell phone plan they should think about having. And these are things that only someone that actually once lived in Canada can actually fully explain to Canadian students. So I think having a Canadian member of faculty is also extremely important from a pastoral standpoint. Now, every law school will also have a skills training program, such as mooting competitions, client negotiations, and criminal advocacy. And so these are programs that allow students to accumulate practical legal skills, negotiation, and courtroom training. Now, what I think it's important is to see whether the university you are choosing has Canada-specific competitions. So competitions that will allow you to moot or negotiate Canadian legal questions, thus allowing you to apply Canada-specific legal content. It also allows you to meet Canadian students at other UK universities and network with firms operating in Canada, because those are the firms that are sponsoring these Canadian-led competitions. Now, one of the big Canadian moots that Sussex participates in is the Mackay Cup, which was sponsored by the Honourable Peter Mackay, which Sussex has won 3 out of the 5 years that it's been running. And the Mackay Cup is held annually at Canada House in London and attended and sometimes judged by Peter Mackay. You might also want to know how Canadian students are performing in comparison to the overall cohort. And this can tell you something about student life at the university, whether Canadian students are getting the kind of support they need. Generally, from having a chat with other faculty members from UK universities that have Canadian students, I found that many of us agree that the Canadian cohort tend to perform a lot better than the domestic students. And so you want to see generally if that's the case at the university that you are thinking of applying to. You may also want to see how your university keeps in touch with its alumni. Do they have strong alumni relations? And this is important because you want to be able to access these networks once you leave the university for advice, for tips, and sometimes for job opportunities. You also want to know this information because you want to know whether you'll continue to have a connection with the university even after you leave, and that you're going to be part of a strong alumni network once you return home. And lastly, this may not seem as important, but actually it's extremely important consideration. You want to look at the location of your university. Okay, most Canadian students dream about living and going to university in London because London is exciting, it's metropolitan, it's culturally and linguistically diverse, it's a wonderful place to live. But you also have to remember that along with these amazing benefits, London can be expensive. It has one of the highest crime rates in the UK. It's ridiculously overcrowded and busy. And some students are completely okay with that because London affords them so many other opportunities, and that's completely fine. But wherever you choose to go to university, make sure it's affordable, you feel safe, and it's in a place that you're going to be happy living in for 30 years. And this may not seem important, this next consideration, but it will once you take an 8 or 9 hour flight from Canada and you just want to get home to your place in the UK. You want to consider what is the closest international airport. Trust me, when I lived in Nottingham, it was just such a trek to come back from Canada during any break, because the closest airport was Heathrow, which is a 4 to 5 bus drive away, 4 or 5 hour bus drive away. And so I had to add that on top of my 8 or 9 hour flight. So I think it's an important consideration to have. So location is quite important, especially if you're going to be living in this place for 2 to 3 years. Okay, living in the UK. Now, these are just sort of some of the tidbits of information that were news to me as I moved to the UK, and I thought it might be something that I would pass on to you so that you're not shocked when you come here to the UK, or you're doing some online research for about your new home. Now, rent in the UK is calculated per week. So if you're looking at on-campus housing, you'll find that it usually lists something like £90 to £150. That's per week, okay? Often if you're a student looking for off-campus housing, landlords in the UK will require you to have a UK guarantor or co-signer on the lease, which as a Canadian student, you might not have any family or friends in the UK, so that might be near impossible. The one way that you can get around this is by paying 6 to 12 months of your rent up front. And this will be held by the letting agency and then given to your landlord every month. But what that means is that you'll have to come up with that £10,000 to £15,000 in September when you actually sign the lease. So there are some impediments to living off campus. This was another thing here that was such a surprise to me. To open a bank account here as an international student, you will need some documentation from the university. But interestingly, and I found this the hard way, when you actually open up a bank account in the UK, you don't actually get your debit card right away. So I had put all my money in this account thinking I was going to get a debit card at the end, which you don't. So you don't get a debit card. You get it in the mail 3 to 4 days after your bank account is opened. And then once you get the bank card, your actual PIN for the bank card comes in a separate letter 2 to 3 days after that. So if you put all your money into a bank account, you actually won't have access to it for 7 to 10 days. And that blew my mind coming from Canada. But one of the greatest things about living in the UK is travel, and travel is cheap. And you can be in another country in less than 2 hours. So I think that's actually one of the biggest benefits of living abroad in Europe. And when I say cheap, I mean, like I said earlier, you can fly to another country for less than $100 return. In terms of working in the UK, for those of you that do want a part-time job while you're studying, as a student, you are able to work based on your visa 20 hours per week during term time and full-time during summer or non-term time. So that includes over Easter break, for example. Again, this is important when you're looking at the location of your university. Also think about opportunities for summer or part-time jobs. Is your university in a city that has the opportunity for you to work part-time? Is it in a town that has good transport links? Those are all things that you need to consider when choosing your institution. Now, in terms of working in the UK after you graduate, a lot of students have asked me about this as well. You should be consulting with the UKVI for this information, but generally, to work in the UK as a Canadian citizen, you will need to have a UK employer to act as your sponsor in order to obtain a work visa. So if you can find a place of employment that is happy to sponsor you, then that's great. Now, just as a side note, in Canada, before you can get licensed, you need to complete the NCAs, then articling, then your bar exams. In the UK, if you decide to stay, you will need to complete a 1-year legal practice course or a barrister's course, so an LPC or a BPTC if you're going to be a barrister, and that is after you finish your degree. You will also need to get a training contract with a firm, which is kind of like articling, and then you'll need to write your bar exams before you can qualify as a solicitor or a barrister. So those are the kind of channels that you have to go through to practice and get licensed in the UK. Okay, so for those of you that are interested in perhaps attending Sussex, I thought I'd tell you a little bit more about my institution. So that's the Sussex University campus. Sussex Law School has been recruiting out of Canada for 10 to 12 years, and I believe almost all of that time has been spent recruiting with Canada Law from abroad. So they're a long-time partner of ours. Approximately 15 to 20% of our law school is made up of Canadian students, so about 80 students doing the graduate entry program and about 100 students doing the 3-year LLB. And most of these students have come through the Sussex Wilfrid Laurier partnership. And so that brings me to the next point about how Sussex has forged long-lasting and one-of-a-kind partnerships with Canadian agents like, for example, Canada Law from Abroad and other agents like across the pond, but also Canadian universities such as Wilfrid Laurier, who we've launched a 5-year joint BA LLB program with. Sussex also, and particularly the law school, keeps in direct contact with our alumni, and we host an alumni event every fall in Toronto, which I'm actually here to attend. I've been attending for the last 5 years, so since we started it. We also hire several alumni throughout the year to help us promote the law school at Canadian events like the Ontario University Fair. So we have a really good, strong relationship with our alumni. Where is the University of Sussex? So we're located in Brighton, which is in southeast England, about a 1-hour train ride away from London. The closest airport is Gatwick. It is an international airport. You can actually fly quite cheaply from Canada to Gatwick. And Gatwick is about 20 minutes away on the train from Brighton. We are a campus university, so everything you could need is on campus: bank, grocery store, doctor's offices. You would never need to travel to the city center for anything, but of course you would want to, because Brighton is actually one of our main selling points, is actually the city that we're in. So it's a town that has a promenade, a beach, a boardwalk pier. We have a great football team, so I'm told. This is more my husband's area than mine. The city is extremely multicultural, probably one of the most liberal cities in England, given our political history and the fact that we have a thriving LGBTQ community. We're known for kind of our bohemian culture, our kind of artsy community. Its location is excellent. It's close enough to London for a day trip, but far enough away to be cheaper, safer, and cleaner to live in. And one of my favorite bits of Brighton is that it actually has a ferry that can go to France in 4 hours. So that's another major selling point. So there are many great things about the University of Sussex, and hopefully when you are thinking about making your decision, it is one of the universities that you're looking at. But wherever you might choose to attend, I hope you're excited about studying and living in the UK, because it's such a great opportunity for Canadian students. And even if you decide that you aren't interested in Sussex, I would be more than happy to help you to make a decision about your future law school in any way that I can. Okay, so with that, I guess I'll stop my presentation there, and I'm happy to take any questions. I think there's several questions that we have here, so I'll read them out and then I will try to answer them. So the first question, I guess I can turn on my webcam here. Okay, so the first question was from Ida. Oh, now I've lost it here. Are there any advantages or disadvantages of a 2-year LLB versus a 3-year LLB? Well, I think the greatest advantage is cost. So you're paying for 2 years of living expenses and tuition rather than 3 years. And then I think one of the cons for many students is that they don't get the opportunity to take all those optional modules, so modules that they're actually interested in: commercial law, corporate law, banking and finance, human rights, the things that, you know, help them specialize and think about what they'd like to specialize in. In terms of job prospects, I haven't really noticed a difference between the 3-year LLB and the 2-year LLB. I think what scares employers most is a student that's gone from high school straight into the 3-year LLB. Just because that student has so much less university experience. But then again, I've had some students that have actually come from high school and have been brilliant and have done extremely well in the job market after they're done. So I think it is possible, but I think that that's the group that I think will have the hardest time in terms of employment, and not so much the 2-year and the 3-year if you've already kind of gotten an undergraduate degree. So hopefully that helps, but if you want to follow up with another question, I'm happy to answer that as well. And then Diana asks, is the first year for the students who come right after high school really difficult? Yes, it is. It's difficult for several reasons, and not all of it is academic. It's difficult because it's their first time away from home. They're quite young, and it's a huge major kind of life change, culture change, that sort of thing. But it's also difficult because I think academically law school is difficult in the sense that you're having to learn to read things and write things in a completely different way. Answering a legal question or a legal problem is very different from writing an answer to an essay question. So it's a whole different way of thinking. But again, like I said, I've had students that have come right out of high school that have been brilliant and that have gotten firsts in their degree. So I think it is doable. Okay, so then I have a question here from Ida again. Are Canadians able to find a job in the UK after graduating? What are the biggest benefits of going to law school in the UK versus Canada? So are Canadians able to find a job in the UK after graduating? I can only speak from the experience that I've had with the alumni that I've kept in contact with, and I do keep in touch, personally keep in touch with a lot of my old students. And when I first started teaching on the program 5 years ago, I have to say I was very apprehensive because I felt that Canadian law schools were so elite that students that have done an international degree would find such a difficult time once they come back here. They would not be able to find articling, they would not be able to find employment. I mean, I was extremely apprehensive. And I have to say, in the last 5 years, I've completely changed my mind. I've met so many students that have done so well, that have had you know, great successes in terms of finding articling, in terms of finding suitable employment after finishing their bar exams. I've met students that have started their own firms. You know, I've kind of met students from all kind of walks, from students that have gone into, like I said, starting their own firms, all the way to students that are not practicing but doing something completely different with their law degree, working for an NGO, working for a charity organization. So I would say that from the students that I've spoken to and the students that I've met, you know, finding a job is a challenge, but I think it's a challenge even if you do a law degree in Canada. The doing the degree in the UK is not the hindrance. It's your grades, it's your references, it's the sort of things that you do outside of school to kind of boost your CV. Those sorts of things all matter. What are the biggest benefits of going to law school in the UK versus Canada? I think there's several benefits. I think one of the benefits that some of my students have said to me that when they've talked to employers that have hired them post-graduation, was that they were really impressed by the fact that these students were willing to go to a completely new country and to learn the legal system and the political system of a completely new country in order to get their law degree. And it shows just a level of commitment and just a level of kind of creativity and initiative that many employers found impressive. A couple of my students, especially ones that are interested in banking and finance and competition law, said that their employers liked the fact that they had a European degree because they had European Union law, which is something that they wanted their associates to have because those companies had European clients. So they were Canadian firms that had European clients. And so it was a benefit for associates to have European Union law. So I think there's those are kind of more professional academic benefits, but there's a whole range of benefits in terms of travel and the sorts of people that you meet at these universities, because the number of international students is so much more varied than Canadian law schools. So I think just kind of more personally enriching experiences as well that have nothing to do with kind of the professional academic side of things. So Omar asks, can I pursue an LLM in Canada? And if I pursue LLM studies in the UK, does that give me an advantage throughout the NCA process? So if you do an LLM in the UK, if you've done a 2-year LLB, so the graduate entry LLB, and you do an LLM on top of that, that will potentially reduce the number of NCA exams that you have to write from 7 to 5. But again, that depends on how the NCA, the sorts of grades that you've gotten and how they review your application. But having that extra year brings the number of NCA exams that you have to write down. You can pursue an LLM in Canada after doing an LLB in the UK. And actually, to a lot of my students, I've recommended that, that they do their LLM back in Canada, because I think that when you go to apply for jobs, if a potential employer is nervous about hiring you because you have a foreign LLB, you can also show them that you actually have done a postgraduate degree in law in Canada, and so that demonstrates that you can be successful in terms of applying Canadian law as well. So I think that doing a UK LLB with a Canadian LLM kind of resolves that issue about potential employers being nervous about your foreign law degree.
Sorry, Sabrina, can I just jump in really quick with a comment about the LLMs?
Yes.
Okay, so there are a few LLMs in Canada that you can take to replace the NCA exams. So, for example, Osgoode Hall offers an LLM in Canadian Common Law, as does UBC, and the University of Toronto has a program. They keep changing the name of it, so you'll have to check that one out online when you graduate and see what it's named this year. Right now, it's a professional studies in law LLM or something, but that does technically replace the NCA process. And there's also a program at the University of Alberta called the Internationally Trained Lawyers Pathway, and that will also replace the NCA exams. It doesn't give you an LLM, but it does give you a classroom setting to complete the requirements for the NCA exams. So we have had extremely good feedback from students who have done particularly the Osgoode LLM, but a couple who've also done the UBC program and the U of A program, about how they got through the process and were able to get jobs through the university, specifically through their career center. So having access to career services at the Canadian university did help them find their articling or job that they were looking for after graduation. So those are options. Bear in mind, though, that if you're looking for a specialized LLM, you will have a much better chance of finding something in the UK than you will in Canada, because we're still very limited here with specialized LLM topics. I think there's one environmental law program, one international law program, and a few other specializations, mainly in Canadian law, like Canadian Aboriginal law, for example. But then if you look at the UK system, you have everything from fashion law through sports law, international human rights law, international business and finance law, all sorts of options. So consider what you want to do for your career and then kind of follow that through along the path to see what the best option would be for you to reach that career goal, whether it's a specialized LLM in an area of study that you want to pursue as a career, or whether it's just to get you through the NCA exams. So that's all I have to say. I'll let you continue with the questions.
I forgot about that. Yes. Perfect. Okay, so Alex, in terms of admission requirements, do UK universities recognize the differences between Canadian universities in terms of prestige and reputation? Example, a 70% average from Western would most likely be comparable to a 75 to 77% average at lower ranked universities like Trent or Brock. We don't. I can't speak for all UK universities. We don't actually create that sort of hierarchy, and I guess this is actually one of the other reasons I think it's good to have a UK faculty member at a law school that you're thinking of applying to, because admissions will sometimes send me the transcript of someone that's applied to Sussex, and I will make that distinction. So if someone's coming to me from University of Toronto versus, you know, smaller university, I will make that distinction. Well, you know, okay, they're sitting just on the cusp here, but, you know, is a much more prestigious university. So we're more likely to potentially take students that just fall below the requirements. But I can't say that all UK universities do that. And I can't say whether, and I know that admissions without that consultation with me is not making those sorts of decisions. It's just based on, you know, what is their grade from the last university or post-secondary institution they attended. How do you guys prepare Canadian students for the transition back to Canada and as well as the bar exams? So we don't do anything with bar exams, and most Canadian universities don't as well. Bar exams happen after you've done your articling positions, and so I have referred students onto private agencies that will prepare students to write bar exams, but we don't do anything with that, especially because bar exams differ based on the province that you want to work in as well. In terms of how do we prepare our students to go back to Canada, well, there's many things that both we do as well as the Canadian Students Law Society do. Like I said, a lot of our preparation in terms of academics has been focused on offering more Canadian modules to prepare students towards the NCA. We are working with Laurier to put together a set of prep courses for Canadian students that do their degree in the UK that will be able to access these NCA prep courses for when they come back, that would be offered through Laurier. But that's still in the planning stages, and there is some thinking going on around offering that to just non-Laurier students, so opening it up to any Canadian student that is in the process of writing the NCA exams. A lot of the other preparation, like I said, it's student-led initiatives. So for example, at the University of Sussex, the Canadian Students Law Society tends to have academic programs scheduled for students throughout the year where they invite alumni through video conferencing to talk to students about different stages of the process that they might be at. So we've had alumni that have talked to students about what it's like writing the NCA exams. We've had alumni come to talk to students about how to apply for art and clean positions, what interviews are like, things like that. We've had alumni come talk to students about bar exams that they're writing, and we've had alumni that are at the final stages that have just gotten full-time employment after being licensed. And so that kind of gives students some tips and strategies of how to prepare for these different processes that they're going to be going through once they graduate. But like I said, these are more student-led initiatives that, of course, Sussex supports financially as well. So that's kind of how we throw in our support behind Canadian students in terms of them transitioning back to Canada. Okay, so Alex asked the question, do admissions prefer a 3-year BA or a 4-year BA for admission into the 2-year graduate entry? I've contacted a few UK schools and most have said they do not care between a 3-year or 4-year BA because most UK undergraduates are 3 years anyways. Yes, that is my experience as well. Since most UK universities are 3 years, they don't make a distinction between a 3-year and a 4-year. We do draw a bit of a distinction between a 4-year honors BA, which again, if an honors BA falls below the minimum grade requirement, we're likely to be a little bit more lenient, but generally we don't make a distinction between 3 and the 4-year. Are the NCAs necessary if you don't intend to use your degree to practice law? No. So if you come back with an LLB and you decide to work in an organization where you're not giving any legal advice, that's completely fine. You don't have to do the NCA exams. The NCA exams are required in order to get articling positions, which you will need in order to write your bar exams, which you will need in order to practice. So if you intend to not do any of that, then you don't need to write the NCA exams. Do you have tutors help out students with their schoolwork? I'm not sure what you mean there. We have tutors that run seminars for students that are part of the curriculum, but we don't actually have tutors, like, I mean, I'm sure you can hire private ones, but none through the university that help you with your, you know, with your assignments or anything like that. I'm not sure if this was an actual question and they've just kind of, Anna, you might need to type in your question again, because all I see is, I do intend to practice law, I'm just wondering, and then it's disappeared. So I don't know if you were hoping to ask me something. Same with Diana, I just see some question marks, but no question. And then again, Diana, can a 3-year LLB student go back to Canada and get their master's? Yes, they can. You can get an LLM with a 3-year LLB, or you can get an MA, a master's in something else as well, other than law. Omar, are there any bursaries that are available to Canadian students? Up until last year, we had the Sussex Excellence Scholarships, but as it stands right now, I think just with whatever's happening, kind of the political climate in the UK, there's been a huge kind of pushback in terms of scholarships and bursaries. So unfortunately, we don't have anything available for Canadian students at the moment. Is there Ida, is there a specific time frame of when you have to complete the NCA exams? Does it have to be immediately after the LLB? It doesn't have to be immediately after the LLB, and I think Heidi might be able to answer this. I know there's a time limit. I think it's 5 to 6 years after you finish your degree. So it has to be completed in 5 to 6 years after you finish your LLB. But maybe Heidi, if you want to jump in, do you know the answer to that?
Yes, absolutely. It is actually 5 years. That's the time limit that they give you post graduation, but there is potential to extend that up to 10 years if there are extenuating circumstances. So if you become ill, if you have a family and have 3 kids running around, if you can prove to the director of the NCA that you need an extension and you have the potential to complete the exams in the 10 years, so the extra 5-year extension, then she will grant that. But I haven't heard of anybody taking longer than maybe 5 years, maximum 2 years on average to complete their NCA exams.
Yeah. Okay, and then I think Diana asked, do you recommend Canadian students to get their masters in the UK or back in Canada? And I think I answered that a bit earlier. I said I generally recommend students, well, it really depends on the student. It depends what kind of master's you're looking for. If it is, like Heidi said, it's a master's to replace the NCA exams, then obviously, yes, you'd have to do that in Canada. If it's a specialized master's in things that like sports law or fashion law or IP or something like that they might not have available at every law school in Canada, then yes, I've recommended to students to stay on in the UK. If it's purely for professional reasons, I tend to recommend to students that it would be good for them to do a master's in Canada so that they can show that they have relevant legal experience both abroad and Canada. So that's what I've recommended to students in the past. But like I said, it really depends on what you're looking to get out of that master's, and perhaps where even you're thinking of working. So if you're thinking about working at an NGO, then I don't think it matters whether your master's is from abroad, and in fact it might look better if it's from abroad than if it is in Canada, but if you're looking at working at, I don't know, Bay Street firm, then it might matter that your master's is from Osgood, even if your law degree is from abroad. So you have to be strategic, I guess, in terms of what you're looking at that master's doing. Okay, so those are all the questions.
Sorry, I was just going to comment a little bit more on the LLMs, just to say that it is partially a research degree. You are doing a dissertation as part of that degree, and it's important to find a support that will provide you with the information and support that you need. So essentially, your supervisor in that project should be someone that can help connect you with the areas of research that you want to do, but also potential employers. So when you're looking at doing your LLM, you really want to do some research into who is providing the advising for that particular area of study in the law school that you're considering, and what connections they have. So are they already working with the UN as a consultant? If that's your end goal, then you really want to be getting your foot in the door with that advisor. So yeah, keeping in mind not only the title of the degree and the content of the degree, but who you're meeting through that degree and where those contacts and that networking can get you in your final career goals.
Right, absolutely.
Excellent.
Okay. So
that's all our questions, I think.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay. Perfect. So I have put a slide up with my contact details, and of course Heidi has all my contact details. We'll also send the slides along to any of you that have attended or signed up to attend, as well as a recording, I guess, of the webinar. But if any of you have any, questions, if you're in the Toronto area and you do want to meet, I'm here for the next 3 or 4 days, and I'd be happy to meet in person if you want to chat about something specific to Sussex or the UK and you just want to meet in person, that's fine too, or by email as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sabrina. A very informative presentation. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure they learned a lot. So I'm excited for follow-up questions. So if anybody does have questions, feel free to, like Sabrina said, contact her, or you can contact your Canada Law Firm Broad advisor, Study Across the Pond advisor, whoever you're working with, to make sure that we get you as much information as possible. And I hope that we will see you all out in events in the next little bit. So check out our website for where we will be in the country in the next few weeks. Other than that, thank you for taking the time to sit with us tonight, and we hope you have a great weekend, and we'll send on information soon. Take care.
Perfect. Thank you.
Shutting it down.